and welcome to this session. I'm delighted to talk to you today about artificial intelligence ethical frameworks and toolkits. This is something that's a really important topic. Ethics impacts everybody, whether we realise it or not. And I'm hoping this session will help you to become more aware of different packages and tools that you can think about that might help and support you in your own journey towards diversity, inclusion, and thinking about how we can all do better to behave more ethically, particularly when we're using technology which impacts so many people. So my name is Jennifer Stirrup, and I am really pleased to be here today. I'm a best-selling Amazon author. I've been coding for 40 years this year, started when I was a very young girl, and I am thrilled to say I've been in the industry for 25 years, and you can see some of my titles there. So what are we going to talk about in this session? We are going to look at a few ethical toolkits for adopting fairness and thinking about ethics in AI. And we're going to look, first of all, at really why this topic is important. What issues are we trying to address? And frameworks for a fairer world. These are really important topics as data becomes increasingly important in organisations. It has an impact on everybody. So, business ethics is the study of business situations, activities and decisions where issues of right and wrong are being addressed. Now, it's not always clear-cut, and there are plenty of different examples where companies are having to learn as they encounter situations. One example is Airbnb. The general counsel for Airbnb actually wrote a book on this topic because he encountered all sorts of ethical and difficult situations as they were sorting out the ethics around the business that they were running. And that could even include anything from what happens if somebody does a lot of damage to property, and what happens if there's been a real problem. It could even be the case somebody, for example, finding a dead body in a Airbnb. So we have to think about so many different situations, and that's external ones. We even see this in internal situations as well. What do you do when people start relationships with one another in the workplace, just as one example? And how can we treat people better in organisations so that they feel included? So the thing is that the future of work is already here, and the future of work is changing. We know that organisations are becoming increasingly reliant on automating technologies. But what does that mean if people's jobs, for example, are being replaced? So let's have a quick look at some of the topics that we might want to discuss. So how does ethics impact your organisation? Now you probably think, well, I'm not sure it really does, to be honest. The thing is, what we do find is that organisations often have a dilemma. They have dilemmas in terms of what do they do when something goes wrong in projects, so we see that quite a bit. But we can also struggle to understand what does it actually mean when we find that there's a conflict between making money and treating people better. Some companies will start to think about that in terms of how much money will we save from this project? How much money will we start to do better in this project? Will it optimize our services in some way? But that may have an impact for individuals in the organization. So that really makes it difficult for organizations to start to consider what they should do when starting up a new project. So that can be really tough. We know that tech companies are encouraging organizations to use AI, and there's a lot of discussion around democratizing AI by making it accessible for every application, every business process, and every employee. But is this actually feasible, given we are already overloaded with data and information every day? So we end up skimming things. So the problem there is that what is a democratic process look like for data and artificial intelligence in particular, there's a real risk of a monopoly deciding the future for AI and everyone else following with that. So there's lots of different ways that this could be implemented, for example, using open source software. Open source is actually rooted in academia. It's a key driver in research, progress in things like artificial intelligence, and it's also a key driver in ethical frameworks as well. So many organisations are invested in looking at open source. That includes Microsoft, Google, LinkedIn, Deutsche Bank, for example, even Uber, have all started to get involved in open source. So it's been adopted by businesses to recruit, retrain and support AI and its implementation in organisations. Organisations want to get to the data dividend really easily and quickly as possible. There's a clear intention to make money from open source and a clear intention to make money from AI. But what can that mean for individuals? Well, the future is already here. Digital transformation increasingly permeates the world of work. We can see this with things like the growth of robots, for example. So there's been some academic studies in this area. I'm just giving you some examples, really to help you to see that actually this is an area which organisations are becoming increasingly concerned about. So if we think about the organisation really becoming more open to the idea of using open source, what we're trying to do is have a look at what AI and digital transformation actually mean in the workplace, given that it's becoming more prevalent technically through the availability of open source. What we see is economies across the world are becoming increasingly integrated. More people are worried about these mega trends on the number of jobs and how that impacts people's lives. You do get some people who will paint quite a bleak version of the future. They argue, for example, that automation could destroy many jobs over the next couple of decades. What we do see, however, is that if you look at the OECD countries, most employment rates have been in an upward trend, but we'll see what will happen after the pandemic. They were in a downward trend. So let's see if things go back to a new normal. Because what we want to be is where jobs are created at a faster rate than they're being destroyed, and you want greater opportunities for people to participate in the labour market, particularly if they were formerly excluded from that. Now, part of that is due to technological change, and globalisation will contribute to that. But all of these things, the pandemic, megatrends appearing in automation and AI, and people feel their jobs are at risk, that all adds up to give us an uncertain future. So what we do see is that the OECD, before the pandemic, estimated that 14% of jobs were at high risk of automation. That's fewer than some researchers have argued. Now, just because a job could be automated doesn't mean it will actually happen. For example, it may not always be cost effective to do, it may not even be desirable, but it does actually raise really interesting legal and ethical concerns, and those will be determined by people's policies and preferences. However, it does mean that those who remain in their current jobs may already start to experience significant change. So, for example, we could see that job churn is one area where we start to see people being excluded from the workplace. So, in terms of looking at AI in automation, the tasks performed and how they're actually conducted may change another percentage of jobs as well. So that includes things like manufacturing sector jobs, for example. So the risk is a bit lower in other verticals, such as health, education, and the public sector, but many sectors will be affected because these sectors employ a large share of the workforce. We also find a concern that women and people in minorities will be impacted adversely by the technological changes. So the OECD actually found some research that showed that that might be the case. So organisations are being encouraged to start to think more carefully about the ethical standpoint that they hold. So organisations are being ranked. You can actually compare countries with one another in terms of how much and how prevalently they are using AI. So you can see here we've got the US and China at the top, and the US at the time of this ranking first. And we can see different areas that the global AI index is actually breaking down opportunities for AI. The problem with that, however, is that this index is really looking at opportunities rather than the risks. And it sometimes is really easy for us to start to look at opportunities and get excited about AI instead of thinking perhaps about the ethics and what that means for certain groups of people, such as economically disadvantaged. How can we skill these people up? And how can we give them every helping hand, particularly if they are aware or concerned about their jobs and living in a very uncertain future? So we've also, there's a few just to lay it into some further context. There's the Future of Humanity Institute. And what they're doing is taking a more multidisciplinary approach, looking at the issues surrounding AI in the workplace and how that affects individuals. So if you're looking for some more academic background on this, looking at the Future of Humanity Institute is there. It's actually part of the University of Oxford in the United Kingdom. So what that's doing is they're bringing together mathematics, philosophy and social science to look at these really big picture questions about humanity and its prospects. The institute itself is led by Professor Nick Bostrom, so it's probably worth just as a follow-up to do some research to have a look at that. So just a bit of futurology. We don't know where things are going to go, but this seems a good place to start. So AI will become more part of everyday work. It's going to be more involved, I think, in making intelligent decisions based on better data. So if we can start to implement ethical frameworks and toolkits at the point the AI is being delivered, deployed, and designed, then hopefully that will have an impact on the decisions the AI is making. Because AI could be making decisions about you, for example. Should you get a credit card or not? Should you get a mortgage? Will the financial service AI algorithm determine that you are a safe bet for giving a credit card to? So algorithms are being used all the time to help make these decisions. So I think it's true that AI will become more of an enabler, less of a threat. When we think about AI, we often think about the Hollywood version of AI, where it's the Terminator or the robot and iRobot, all of these things, you know. So that's a very general version of AI. But what we are thinking about is much more specific, human-inspired ways of computing, where the algorithm is very good at solving one problem and solving one problem really well. So you may have AI with you every single moment of the day because our phones have got some AI in them. Anytime you are using your maps, if you're using Google Maps, it's using a human-inspired thinking to help you to find your destination. And I don't know about you, but I need all the help I can get, so I'm very happy for the convenience. Humans do like convenience. Humans, we love convenience, we like things easy, and we are enabled by AI in so many different ways. For example, even Alexa. I'm saying that quietly because I have Alexa in every room in the house, listening into my conversations and waiting for my command. Now, the thing is with Alexa is that it's very good at one thing, receiving small sentences and returning a result back to you. So what that does is it can help humans to become more productive. It helps us to work faster, and it helps us to think more creatively about problems. One of my customers uses AI to help decipher handwriting. Now, the AI algorithm is using computer vision to read and scan the text, and it's trying to decipher what the handwriting means. What happens is The AI does the easy part, the handwriting that's nice and neat, easy to decipher. The human then checks it over to make sure it's worked all right. What the AI then is being used is really to automate and help make a process go faster, but a human is still involved in it. And I think that's where you'll start to see more and more of AI being involved in things. So we talk about augmented intelligence, where we have a mix of human and AI brought to bear on a problem. I tend to say AI is being an extra pair of hands or an extra tool in the office that you can use to solve problems. And I'm hoping that's the direction of travel for AI, where we're trying to combine the best of both. And I believe people's jobs will change, but hopefully we won't be losing people. That's really what we are concerned about, I think. So how can we level the playing field for organisations that are thinking about AI? Well, what we can do is think more carefully about having high quality data sets. Now, the thing with that is that often we start to look at data sets and we think, well, it's just data, we'll just collect up lots of it and everything will be fine. And actually that is simply not true. We know, for example, that some organisations were using biased data sets. One algorithm was actually more likely to put forward people of a certain group for technical roles than it was to do that for people in different groups. And the reason for that was the algorithm felt more confident about making that decision. And the reason for that was it had more data to support that decision. So if you, for example, have got a data set of CVs, 90% of the CVs are for men and 10% are for women and non-binary, then the problem there is that the algorithm is more confident about predicting a male for a technical job than it is for female and non-binary. So the problem there is we start to run into the issues of having better data sets. So we can think about how we can try and generate more open source fairer data sets that people can use for use in their work and their research and businesses as well. There is some work going on in that at the moment. It's quite a new area. I think it's quite interesting. So you may have seen things like coded bias in Netflix. And what coded bias did was it was talking about the really sad case actually of a woman of colour who was trying to do research, and her own the algorithms that she was working with simply did not recognise her because of her colour. And it's terrible when we think of people being treated that way and how awful that must feel actually on a human level. So what we're trying to do is make data sets fairer and more equitable. So if you are, for example, looking at CVs, that you have a fairer representation, or you're working with the data with a recognition that the data is sloped in one way rather than another. So we've got different ways that we can start to look at data sets, and that's one of them. So there's quite a lot of things that we can do to try and make things better for people. So in terms of AI research tools, and I'll give you some of the names of the frameworks which I've seen in action, and I think that these are really nice ways of trying to tackle the problem. I should add that there's quite a lot of them. I'll just point you to a few, however. So what I would like to think about is, how does ethics impact your organisation? So if you're working in data projects, how do you then move forward to think about the ethics, responsibility and sustainability of the decisions that you're making? You may find that companies have to make difficult choices between making a profit and doing some work which may end up to some harm being done somewhere. For example, people losing jobs. So there is a difficult dilemma where rejecting projects can have a financial penalty, and adopting an ethically risky project can actually end up in a situation where there could be reputational risk somewhere. We see lots of examples of that happening, where companies are embarrassed after they've made a mistake somewhere, and then they try to rein it back in again. So the problem with that, I think, is that people are apologising after they've done it, rather than thinking about ways of behaving better in the first place, and we don't really want to be in that situation either. So just things to think about. When I'm starting new projects, I'm looking at it in terms of the impact in a longer term. So I'm not just looking at what cost will this save, how will this increase productivity, how will this increase profit somewhere. I am thinking about what does this actually mean for the people in the organisation, and what harm might this do either to people internally or people externally as well. So this can be quite interesting as well. What we're trying to do is think about responsibility. How can organisations become more responsible in terms of their attitude and responsibilities? Now, there is a difference between accountability and responsibility, which I would like to point out here. What we do see sometimes at organisations will make decisions, and that decision will be made by someone high up in the organisation. But because the organisation is somehow regarded as doing something innovative and cool with new technology, it's not always the case that they are impacting organisations and people within them in a very good way. So I've added in a definition of responsibility here, defining that as a broader concept about the relationship the business has with the community and basically the stakeholders. If you can imagine a sort of stakeholder model, you've got your customers, your community around you, employees. You may also have a tech community component as well. So responsibility really links directly with leadership. But the person that's responsible for writing algorithms that are perhaps unfair is not perhaps the person that's accountable for those decisions. When you get AI involved, people want to know who to blame when it goes wrong, particularly if it doesn't get the results that they want. So look at Tesla, for example. If you've got self-driving cars, who's to blame if that car crashes? Is it the designers? Is it the owners, the stakeholders? Was it the persons who decided not to drive that day? I don't know. There's so many different ways of looking at it, but it's all about working out who is ultimately responsible. Now, sometimes I see organisations confusing responsibility with corporate social responsibility, but it's actually a bit wider than that. It's about taking ownership, putting your hand up to say, yes, I am owning that problem, ultimately. Because the developers doing that are doing their jobs. It could be that the owner or the decision maker or the stakeholders will fundamentally say, yes, we are accountable and responsible. We also think about sustainability as well. What does this mean for the environment? We keep hearing that AI is going to do great things for climate change. Now, I'm reluctant to use the term climate change in some way because it sounds almost cozy, the climate's changing. What we really need to say is something more like reflecting the reality of the problems with the climate that we see. It's more than changing. So we need to think about sustainability. So AI can help with that, I should think. Even things like working from home might help as well. But what we need to do is think about the longer term impact. And the Brundtland Commission defines sustainability as meeting the needs of the present generation without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. I actually really like this definition of sustainability. It's something that we can think about. I'll put in a reference there for you to look that up if you'd like. So we need to think about sustainability as well. So we can also think about the way that we can deal with this ethically in the organisation. So the ethics is catching up with the technology. So that's what I really mean when I say that people are looking at the success that they have now, rather than the consequences that they might have later on for doing something that's not quite right. So the thing with that is what people are trying to do is build things that are successful, but we want a good way of trying to connect people together in a way that is bringing ethics together. So what we see here in this particular example is a few examples of some of the toolkits that you might want to look at in order to become more familiar with this area as well. Now there's lots of different toolkits, there's not always one tool for the same job, so we have to think about different ones. So we're trying to build AI systems where we're in-building some of these open source toolkits as we go along. So I'm just going to give you some ideas of things that you might want to start to look at. So we'll give you just an overview of some of these. Now, when we start to look at the toolkits, what we're trying to do is to break them down into different areas. So here I want to credit DataKind and the team of volunteers at DataKind. We have all been working very hard together to try and pull together a practitioner's toolkit that you can go and find online over at the DataKind UK's website. I'm part of the ethics committee. And what we're trying to do is put together ways that people in data science and AI can start to help one another and to implement these toolkits. So we're trying to have quite a broad reach. So what we see is the toolkits are trying to address a number of different things. So one of them is fairness. I haven't left a definition here on purpose. It's really tough to define fairness. I guess the best way we can think about it is how can we make sure that everybody is included? Now, we seem to have a very good way of thinking of, fairness is one of these things that even very young children have got a strong sense of what is fair very, very early on in their careers, very early in their lives. Young children have got ways of considering something being fair or not fair. So what that's trying to do for fairness is put together a comprehensive set of metrics for data sets and for models to test biases, and also to look at explanations for those metrics as well. So we have a gut sense of how things are fair or not fair. And it's often about context as well. So it's not very easy to think and define that. So I want to mention just a few fairness algorithms that are trying to help make sure everybody is included. Now, explainability is where we are trying to work out what the artificial intelligence is doing. So what we're trying to do there is take the models and work out what they are doing and explaining how they got to a particular result. So that can be quite a hard thing to do. The reason for it being tough is that there's so many different things that we need to try and consider. So when we're looking at some of these toolkits, what we're trying to do is quite a tough thing actually. We're trying to look at it in terms of getting AI models into production, getting them productive and producing results, preferably as accurately as possible, and then returning actions along with that. So we talk about the last mile problem of analytics, where we deliver some sort of analytical data product, and it goes off and produces advanced analytics. But with AI, it's a bit different, because the last mile of AI is actually the first mile in some ways, when the model has gone live into production, and it's actively producing results using fresh data. The thing is that we need to keep on top of what those models are actually doing. AI and ML applications exhibit emergent properties. So what that really means is very small changes in the models can often have quite big changes in the results. And the AI models may be dealing with a lot of data. There may be millions of iterations as part of the processing and learning. So it's quite difficult to track what the models are doing. That's particularly the case when there are changes over time. So it's hard to explain what the model is doing and why. And that's just as a result of the properties of the models themselves, and what they've been asked to do is to make predictions using fluid data in very dynamic and challenging environments. So that's explainability. So there's a few toolkits which I'd like to share with you. This one is called Accurateass. I hope that I'm saying that properly. Now, Accurateass is one of the tools that you can use in order to look at bias. It's been aimed mainly at a developer type of audience and used for data analysts, people that are data savvy. It's got the objective of auditing machine learning models in terms of bias and discrimination. And it's helping you to think about different ways of deploying and developing those models. It's telling you the risk is really the outcome that it's doing here. Okay, so Deon is another one, and I hope that I'm saying that properly. It's another ethical checklist approach. Now, it's quite a useful one. It's a good starting point. It's easy to integrate into projects that you already have. It's a command line tool, so again, it's very much aimed at developers. It's allowing you to add in ethical checklists to data science projects, and it allows you to have a checklist file, and you can also use them those files in many common formats. Now that's a nice one. It seems quite popular. People can start to record and identify the checks that they're doing this in order to try and improve the programs over time. So that's an important thing to consider as well. So Deon is another good one that I see quite commonly. Another one that's more business focused, I think, and perhaps a bit broader, is using the digital catapult. And one that you see here, you've got the digital catapult AI ethics framework, and that's another one that's actually really important as well. I like this one because it's quite broad, actually. You can go off and look at the Digital Capital website. It's got AI ethical framework. It's very comprehensive. There's lots of questions that you need to go through while it's producing while working with the framework. But it's thorough. It's quite business oriented as well. It's quite easy to follow. So I think that's a good one to have a look at as well. So there's a few there, and just a few main ones I've come across that I think are quite popular. So why is this important? We really want to think about the data foundation that we are building as part of AI. Now, if the data set is biased, if the data is discriminatory in any way, so it hasn't been producing a good data set, what it will do is it's a case of garbage in, garbage out. We use this term in terms of data warehousing. We also use it in business intelligence, and we use it in AI as well. So the problem there is that if we are not careful, the problems with the data will go right through the whole system end to end. So there's a few ones that you can use with your development packages in Python, for example, that will help that process and help you to identify and trap it earlier. So there's a few if you use Python, there's one called Scikit Lego, and it's part of the program itself is called Scikit Fairness. It's open source, and it's mainly used with regression and binary classification, and it covers a range of fairness metrics. So it's covering things like demographic parity and also the equal opportunity difference as well. There's some proprietary ones as well. So IBM have developed their own algorithm called IBM Fairness 360. It's much more aimed at using with binary classification, and like the Scikit Fairness, it's also for use within the equal opportunity difference as well. It's got a few other ones in there too, such as the average odds difference. So how does that sit with Accurateass? Accurateass is also aimed at binary classification, and it's good for looking at things like true and false positive negative rates. It's more of a fairness auditing tool, and it's also looking at things like discovery and emission rates as well. So Google also have a tool which is called the What If tool, And what if is very easy for people to understand. From a business perspective, we understand what if quite well. So when we look at the Google What If tool, it's used for both multi-class and regression as well. So we've got a range of group fairness metrics that it will work to produce. So again, using demographic parity again, equal opportunity, and it will also work with individual fairness as well, using various techniques for that. If you're using a Python, you've got another package called PyMetrics. Now it's aimed at classification rather than regression, and it's looking at things like disparate impact as well. So there's various advantages and disadvantages of each of the toolkits. So when we look at Accurateass, for example, it's very simple to learn and to use, which is probably why we see it popping up. It's quite an intuitive web interface. If you're not very technical, you can start to use that. And there's lots of documentation and lots of demos to help you to get started. So it's very heavily, I hate to say it, biased towards bias at the moment, but that's what it's looking at. It'd be great to see where that goes in terms of future steps. And coming back to Scikit Fairness, part of Scikit Lego, again, very easy to install, very easy to use for regression algorithms. It's quite limited in functionality at the moment, but there's no reason you couldn't start to think about combining tools to see if that would help. So the IBM Fairness one, obviously proprietary, it's very well supported in terms of documentation, and it's got great tutorials to help you to get started. It's very robust as well, as you might imagine, with IBM being behind it. Now, when we look at the Google What If tool, super easy to install. It's just 3 lines of code. If you're a data scientist, you're probably using Jupyter, and it runs in Jupyter Notebook, and it uses TensorBoard as well. So it's good for exploring the data. As you might imagine, it's using the term what if, so of course it's going to be good for that. So the only thing it might be if you are using it and you're not using Google, then that might be an issue as well. So what we are trying to do is look at it from a data foundation up when we're starting to build with AI. I've mentioned a few tools specifically for fairness, but what we're trying to do is pull all of these things together and think about the ethics at each point in the project, from deciding on the project in the first place and thinking about that process of, is it fair? What harm might this do? Then when we start to design the project, after the vision has been set out for it, what questions are we asking ourselves to try and make sure that it's been designed, for example, with accessibility and fairness in mind right from the start? And then we can think about the data sets as well. Are the data sets balanced properly? Are they fair? If not, what are we going to do about that? We could use something like the SMOTE algorithm in order to balance out data sets. SMOTE is SMOTE. You may come across that one. What it does is, if you've got very imbalanced data sets, it will balloon up the poorer data set part, and it will contract the part of the data that is weighted in favour for. So in our example of 90% male and then 10% female and non-binary, it's going to contract down the 90% data set, and it's going to balloon up the 10%. So it becomes more equal. You can do different configurations with it. So for example, you might decide, well, I'm just going to balloon up one side and not do anything with the other. So there's lots of different ways you can play with that data set to try and get it to be more fair. And thinking about how the ethics impacts the business decisions that are taking place. You know, what is it we're ultimately trying to do? And ultimately, every organisation at some level is thinking about how best to serve that customer and to serve everyone consistently well and fairly across the organisation. That will help the business to grow better overall. Some companies have suffered really badly in social media because they have done things which have been deemed to be unfair. One example I have in my head is the Pepsi advert from a few years ago, where it was regarded not very well on social media for various reasons. You can go and have a look at that. So what are the next steps? in terms of the industry, and what next steps can we take? I think one thing that would be really useful is to have better tools and more tools to explore AI ethics. Now, MIT have actually produced a project where you can go and play with it online. It's can AI make you fairer than a judge? So it's a courtroom algorithm game, and it's one of these ways that's helping you to think about the topics that are involved. So I suggest you go off and have a look at that. Another great tool, I think, to explore AI ethics is looking at Google's AI Explorables. I think Google are doing a lot. I know they have been hit hard, I think, in social media by the way that they have, there's been various issues over ethics and its implementation and how that's impacted members of staff. And I think that's really sad. I was sad to see the outcomes. But what I'm hoping is that good things will come of that, that people will think more mindfully of it. And this really brings ethics into a much sharper focus than it perhaps would have been otherwise. That's the only good thing I can think about it. But I can see companies are thinking more about ethics. I think that's a good thing. But I do like some of what Google is doing. I like the AI Explorables. I like the What If tool to help people work their way through thinking about these issues. But the main thing is to help people to get started. And by making it easy for organisations to get started, they're more likely to adopt it. We can't make it far away from people. Okay. So just a quick summary. In this session, we've gone through and had a look at some of the ethical issues involved in AI. I've tried to convince you that it's important. I read a survey recently that said only 6% of business leaders are thinking about ethics. I just thought, oh, that's just not what I want to hear. Let's see if we can get it up to 7% next year, shall we? So, but if I can come along and try to come with all of us on this journey to understand better ethics, how we can do better, I think that would be a good thing. Because ethical leadership in businesses will help individuals and organisations to navigate uncertain, ambiguous and diverse situations. And I'd like to add, I think it should be inclusive of everybody so that nobody's left behind. People from different backgrounds are not left behind as part of these technological advances that are coming. So hopefully that is giving you some ideas to go off and get started. And there's an overall business incentive to look at ethics. It could incur in risks perhaps if you don't start to look at it, because you can't be really sure that you understand your customer until you're looking at them in terms of the longer term and what they think about their relationship with your company. But if you don't have a clear understanding of what the company's doing and the direction of travel for ethics, it's difficult to make those decisions when you're thinking about your relationship with the customer longer term. And you can really think about it in terms of the quote by Maya Angelou. Maya Angelou, incredible American author. And she said something along the lines of, people don't always remember what you said. Sorry, I'll say that again. So Maya Angelou said something along the lines of, people don't always remember what you said. They don't always remember what you did, but they remember how you made them feel. And I think businesses and organisations need to remember that when they start to think about how they interact with the technical community, their customers, their employees, and their relationships with the wider world in which they live. So with that in mind, I'd like to say a big thank you for listening to this session. I hope it's been interesting for you, and I hope the mention of some of the toolkits will give you some actionable takeaway points to go up and follow about this yourself. So thank you. I've pulled together just some references that you might want to follow up. I would look up the DataKind website, I would mention that. I've put in some references for Accurateass, Blowfield I mentioned earlier, and Deon with that one as well. So the study in the ethical consumer, 5 unethical companies. I'm not going to share what that is. You have to go and look at that yourself. And then some other references, 5 key questions to identify key stakeholders. So just a good way of trying to think about the longer term impact of the project that you're considering. Then Kaplan, obviously you will have heard of Kaplan if you are involved in data in any way, a legend who talks a lot about business scorecarding and various methodologies of that, and recommends the others for some readership as well. I think these are just a starting point if you're interested in really diving deep in this area. So with that, thank you very much for joining me in this session. I hope it's been interesting. And if you have any questions at all, please do let me know. Don't hesitate to reach out, and I will give you my details again. So you can go off and find me online. I'm on LinkedIn, I'm on Twitter far too much, and email. I also do answer email. You can catch me at hello@data-relish.com, and that's where I live there. So thank you very much for your time. Hope you've enjoyed the session, and I look forward to hearing from you.